Hey everyone, welcome back to Mindcode Vault, where we unlock the secrets to a sharper, happier mind. Today, I'm sharing 11 powerful mind hacks from Don't Believe Everything You Think You Need Today that can transform the way you think and live. Make sure to hit that subscribe button, give this video a like, and share it with your family and friends who need a mental boost. Drop your thoughts in the comments below, I love reading them. Let's dive in and discover the tricks that can make every day brighter. There is a version of your life that never happened, and you have been grieving it every single day without knowing it. You have been making decisions based on a story your mind told you years ago. A story built from one embarrassing moment, one person's careless words, one failure that felt too large to survive. And the terrifying part is not that the story is wrong. The terrifying part is that you have never once questioned whether it is true. Most people go through their entire lives running software they did not consciously install. They wake up, and the mental programs run automatically, the ones that say you are not quite smart enough, not quite ready, not quite the kind of person who gets those opportunities. And they live inside those programs like they live inside gravity, never questioning it, never even noticing it is there, because it has always been there. That is the quiet crisis of the human mind. Not trauma, not weakness, just the unexamined assumption, running on a loop, shaping every choice, every relationship, every moment of courage you almost had. Joseph Nugent's Don't Believe Everything You Think is not a self-help book in the traditional sense. It does not give you a morning routine or a 5-step formula. What it does is far more disruptive. It pulls back the curtain on the engine of human suffering, which Nguyen identifies not as circumstance, not as other people, and not even as emotion. He identifies it as thinking itself, not bad thinking, not negative thinking. Thinking as a mechanism. The relentless, automatic, largely unconscious production of thoughts that we then treat as facts, as identity, as truth. And once you see that clearly, once that curtain is pulled back, you cannot unsee it. That is precisely what this audiobook is designed to do. What follows are 11 of the most powerful, practically urgent insights distilled from Nugent's work. Each one examined not as a philosophical abstraction, but as something that is affecting your money, your career, your relationships, and your capacity to move through the AI-accelerated, high-pressure, high-noise world of today. These are not ideas to admire. They are tools to use, starting now. The first insight is the one that changes everything, and it is also the one most likely to make you defensive. You are not your thoughts. Read that again, but more carefully this time. Not, you should try not to identify with your thoughts. That is therapeutic advice. This is something more fundamental. Nugent draws on the philosophical tradition of non-duality and the psychological science of metacognition to make a claim that is structurally precise. Thoughts are events that happen to you, not declarations that come from you. They arise, they pass, and in between arising and passing, the untrained mind does something catastrophic. It picks them up, holds them, decorates them with memory and fear, and then calls them me. Think about the last time you had an intrusive thought, something anxious, something that showed up uninvited at 2 in the morning. Did you choose that thought? Did you sit down and deliberately construct it, word by word? Of course not. It arrived, and yet, within seconds, you were arguing with it, negotiating with it, defending yourself against it, or collapsing under its weight. You treated an uninvited guest as though it owned the house. That is the beginning of almost every form of mental suffering, and it is the loop that keeps talented, capable, intelligent people stuck in lives that are smaller than they deserve. The modern application of this is urgent. In the attention economy, where your feed is algorithmically engineered to provoke, to outrage, to make you feel behind, to make you feel inadequate, the inability to separate yourself from your thoughts is not just uncomfortable, it is expansive. Entrepreneurs who cannot separate their identity from their business metrics make panic decisions at exactly the wrong moments. Freelancers who cannot separate their self-worth from a client's rejection cycle through burnout every 6 months. Employees navigating the rise of AI in their industries, who fuse their fear thoughts with factual analysis, end up paralyzed instead of pivoting. The skill of noticing a thought as a thought, not a verdict, not a prophecy, just a neural event, is one of the highest leveraged skills of the 21st century, and almost no one is teaching it. The second insight builds directly on the first, and it arrives with a kind of quiet devastation. The source of all psychological suffering is thought, not circumstance. Nguyen is careful here, and we should be, too. He is not saying that hard things do not happen. He is not dismissing loss, injustice, or difficulty. What he is pointing to is something more precise, the difference between pain and suffering. Pain is the signal. Suffering is the story you layer on top of the signal, and that story is made entirely of thought. Here is how this works in practice. 2 people lose their jobs on the same day, in the same company, in the same layoff. One of them experiences grief, uncertainty, and fear, and then, within weeks, begins reaching out to their network, reassessing their skills. and discovering that the layoff was actually an exit from a role that had been diminishing them for years. The other person loses the same job and spends 18 months in a spiral of shame, replaying the moment of the phone call, constructing elaborate narratives about what it means about their value, their future, their luck. The external event was identical. The suffering was not about the job, it was about the thought story built around the job. And that story was chosen not consciously, not maliciously, but chosen nonetheless, in the sense that it was accepted without examination. This is not a call to toxic positivity. Nguyen is adamant about that. The invitation is not to force yourself to think happy thoughts. That is just thought suppression wearing an optimism costume, and it does not work. The invitation is to see thought clearly, to recognize when you have left the present moment and entered the narrative, and to understand that the narrative is optional. When you stop adding thought to pain, what remains is pain. And pain is survivable. Pain moves through. Pain, when met directly, often resolves far faster than the story about the pain ever does. The third insight is perhaps the most counterintuitive, and it directly challenges something most high-achieving people believe is their greatest asset. The analytical mind is often the enemy of clear perception. Nguyen draws a distinction between thinking about experience and being an experience, and he argues that our culture's obsession with analysis, strategy, and cognitive frameworks has produced a generation of people who are incredibly skilled at processing life and completely unskilled at living it. Here is where this gets economically significant. In an economy increasingly dominated by artificial intelligence, the things that are hardest to automate are not analytical tasks. Those are exactly what AI does best. What AI cannot replicate is presence, genuine intuition, authentic human connection, and the kind of creative insight that comes from a mind that is not overloaded with self. The irony is profound. At the precise moment in history when being deeply human is the most economically valuable thing a person can be, most humans are running from their own experience into the noise of constant analysis and distraction. The freelancer who is constantly second-guessing their pricing, their positioning, their niche, who spends more time thinking about their business than building it, is not suffering from a lack of strategy. They are suffering from an excess of unchecked thought. The executive who cannot make a decisive call because every decision spawns 15 more analytical threads is not underprepared. They are overthinking their way into inaction. Nguyen's prescription is not to think less, it is to trust that, with clarity that emerges through the mind rather than from fighting with it. When the mind is quiet, perception is sharp. When the mind is noisy, even the best analysis becomes contaminated by anxiety. The fourth insight is where the book becomes genuinely urgent for anyone navigating financial stress, career uncertainty, or the existential pressure of building something. In a volatile world, fear-based thinking is not protective, it is destructive, and it masquerades as wisdom. This is the one that costs people the most money, the most opportunities, the most years. Fear-based thinking has a very convincing disguise. It sounds like prudence. It sounds like due diligence. It sounds like the responsible inner voice that is just trying to protect you from making a mistake. I should wait until I am more ready. I should not raise my rates. What if clients leave? I should not launch that product. What if it fails? I should not leave this job. What if the next one is worse? Every one of those sentences feels like wisdom. Every one of them is in Newton's framework. Thought masquerading as guidance. Real wisdom, the kind that comes from a quiet mind, from intuition, from the deeper intelligence that operates beneath the noise, does not feel like fear. It feels like clarity. There is a quality of stillness to genuine insight that is completely different from the frantic, urgent, story-filled quality of fear-based thinking. And once you can feel that difference, once you have experienced enough moments of genuine clarity to recognize it, you start to realize how much of what you thought was careful reasoning was actually just anxiety in a three-piece suit. In the context of money, this is devastating to examine honestly. Most people's financial decisions are not made from clarity. They are made from a fear story that was installed sometime in childhood, usually by watching how the adults around them related to scarcity, to risk, to debt, to wealth, and that fear story runs in the background of every pricing decision, every investment, every raise request that never got made. The antidote is not financial education, though that helps. The antidote is learning to recognize the feeling of fear-based thought and deliberately pausing before acting from it. That pause is worth more than any strategy. The fifth insight is the one that will sound the most spiritual and is actually the most practical. You have access to an intelligence that is greater than your thinking mind, and most people never use it. Nguyen calls this inner knowing, and he is careful not to dress it in religious language. He is pointing to something that neuroscience, cognitive psychology, and contemplative traditions all confirm from different angles. There is a form of knowing that does not come from analysis. It comes from stillness. It arrives as a sense of rightness, a clear direction, an intuition that resists explanation but proves reliable when trusted. Athletes call it being in the zone. Artists call it flow. Entrepreneurs sometimes call it gut instinct. though they rarely trust it as much as they should. What Nguyen argues, and this is where he becomes most radical, is that this intelligence is not a rare gift. It is the default state of a mind that is not cluttered with excessive thought. In other words, the clarity you're looking for is not something you need to acquire. It is something you need to stop blocking. And what blocks it, almost entirely, is the habit of thinking about thinking. The metacognitive loop that most ambitious people live inside permanently. The practical application is immediate. The next time you are facing a decision that analysis cannot resolve, and you will know it, because you will have been going around in circles for days or weeks, stop. Not to give up, not to be irresponsible. Stop to let the mind settle. Go for a walk with no podcast. Sit quietly for 20 minutes with no agenda. Do something physical and absorbing. And notice what arises in the aftermath. More often than not, what arises is not confusion. It is clarity that was there all along, waiting for the noise to clear. The sixth insight confronts one of the most painful illusions people carry, particularly in ambitious professional culture. The belief that your worth is a function of your performance is not a motivating truth, it is a crippling lie. Nguyen addresses this with unusual tenderness, because he understands that this particular story is often the one people are most attached to. They believe that if they stop tying their worth to their output, they will become lazy. They believe that the self-criticism, the relentless drive, the refusal to celebrate wins, all of that is what makes them good. They have made a virtue of their own suffering. The research and lived experience both contradict this. People who operate from a foundation of unconditional self-worth, who do not need a result to feel okay, consistently outperform people who are driven by fear of inadequacy. They take more intelligent risks because they are not terrified of failure defining them. They recover from setbacks faster because the setback does not trigger an identity crisis. They make cleaner decisions because they are not distorted by the need for external validation. And, critically, they are far more likely to continue when things get hard, because their fuel is not the brittle energy of proving themselves, it is the sustainable energy of genuine engagement. For anyone building a freelance practice, a business, a creative career, or navigating the increasingly brutal landscape of corporate restructuring and AI replacement anxiety, this insight is not optional. The people who will thrive in the next decade are not the ones with the most skills. They are the ones with the most psychological resilience. And psychological resilience is impossible to build on a foundation of conditional self. The seventh insight addresses something specific to the modern moment. The noise of the information environment is not just distracting, it is cognitively colonizing your decision-making capacity. Nguyen wrote this book for a world in which human minds are under more external pressure than at any previous point in history. The sheer volume of information, opinion, comparison, and stimulation that the average person consumes in a single day would have been unthinkable 20 years ago. And the cumulative effect of that consumption on the quality of thinking is not neutral. When the mind is constantly taking in, constantly reacting, processing, comparing, scrolling, it never gets the rest it needs to produce insight. The shower thought, the walk-home realization, the 3 a.m. clarity, these are not accidents. They happen in the gaps, in the quiet, in the moments when the input stops and the mind has space to integrate. And most people today have systematically eliminated all of those gaps. There was always a podcast, a news alert, a notification, a reel. There is always more, and so the mind is always reactive, and reactive minds do not make good decisions. They make fast ones. The actionable shift here is radical by modern standards, but simple in principle. Protect silence. Treat quiet time not as an absence of productivity, but as its source. It's a schedule, unconnected time, the way you schedule meetings. Resist the urge to fill every gap with content. The paradox is that the people who consume the least information about their industry are often the most creative within it, because their minds have space to connect dots that the constantly consuming mind never even sees. The eighth insight cuts to something so obvious it hurts. Most people do not actually want answers, they want comfort, and those are not the same thing. Nguyen observed that a significant portion of the thinking people do is not genuinely problem-solving. It is worry narrating, replaying scenarios, imagining worst cases, constructing elaborate defensive stories that feels like it is working toward a solution, but is actually just the mind trying to soothe its own anxiety by the act of thinking. It is motion without movement, and it is exhausting. The distinction matters enormously in practical terms. If you are genuinely problem-solving, the thinking moves forward. New possibilities emerge, obstacles get mapped and navigated. There is a quality of momentum to it. If you are worry-narrating, the thinking loops. You cover the same ground repeatedly, reaching the same anxious conclusions, and nothing changes except your cortisol levels. The tell is the loop. The moment you notice you are thinking the same thought for the third time about the same situation, you are no longer problem-solving, you are worry-narrating, and the prescription is not to think harder. It is to step back, feel whatever fear is underneath the narrative, and let the mind rest before returning to the question. For anyone in a high-pressure business environment, anyone managing cash flow, Anyone pitching for new clients, anyone facing a performance review or a product launch, this distinction can save enormous amounts of energy. The hours spent in anxious circular thinking are not just unpleasant, they're expansive. They deplete the cognitive resources that genuine problem-solving requires. And the irony is that most of the solutions people finally reach arrive not after the longest thinking sessions, but after the shortest, after a break, a sleep, a walk, a genuine conversation. The mind solves best when it is allowed to settle. The ninth insight is the one most directly relevant to relationships, and it is blunt. Almost every interpersonal conflict is a conflict between two people's thoughts, not between two people. Nguyen argues that when two people argue, they are rarely arguing about the thing they think they are arguing about. They are arguing about the meaning their individual minds have assigned to the thing, meanings shaped by old wounds, old patterns, old fears. And those meanings are thoughts. They are not facts. They are interpretations. And interpretations can be revised. This matters practically in any collaborative context. Partnerships, teams, marriages, client relationships. The person who makes you furious is not usually doing what you think they are doing. They are doing something, and your mind is interpreting it through a lens of past experience. And the interpretation is generating the emotion, and the emotion is generating the conflict. When you can see the thought, when you can say to yourself, "This is my interpretation, not their intention," the space for genuine understanding opens up. Not always, not instantly, but far more often than the mind, when it is confident in its story, will allow. In professional settings, this insight alone can transform how teams function. The colleague who seems obstructive is often not obstructing. They're carrying a thought about the project, about their role, about their safety, that has not been named. The client who seems demanding is often not demanding, they are afraid, and fear has a way of expressing itself as control. When you stop arguing with people and start getting curious about the thought underneath their behavior, the resolution tends to arrive at a fraction of the cost. The 10th insight is where Nguyen becomes most quietly revolutionary. Freedom is not something you find, it is something you return to. The premise of most self-improvement work is that you are broken and need to be fixed. That freedom is a destination you reach after enough work, enough healing, enough practice. Nguyen inverts this entirely. He argues that your natural state, the state you inhabited before the thought stories got installed, is already free, already whole, already clear. What psychological work is actually doing, at its best, is not building something new. It is removing what has been layered on top of what was already there. This reframing is not semantic. It has profound practical implications. If you believe freedom is something you have to earn, you will always find a reason you have not earned it yet. There will always be more work to do, more healing to complete, more growth to achieve before you are allowed to feel okay. But if you understand that freedom is your original state, that it is available right now, in this moment, whenever you stop believing every thought your mind produces, then the path is not forward, the path is inward, and it is available to everyone, regardless of how broken they believe themselves to be. The 11th and final insight is the one that ties all the others together, and it is both the simplest and the hardest. The practice is not a practice, it is a seeing. Nguyen does not ask you to meditate for 20 minutes a day, though that helps. He does not ask you to journal your thoughts, though that can be useful. What he ultimately invites is something more continuous and more radical, the ongoing moment-by-moment recognition that what you are experiencing as reality is being filtered through thought, not occasionally, constantly, and that the moment you see that, really see it, not just understand it intellectually, something shifts. The grip loosens. The story loses a degree of its authority, and in that fraction of a degree of loosening, you become just slightly more free. That fraction compounds. It compounds across days, across decisions, across years. The person who has been seeing thoughts clearly for 3 years makes different financial decisions, different relationship decisions, different career decisions than the person who is still fully fused with every thought that arises. Not because they are smarter, not because they work harder, because they are operating from a clearer signal. And in a world that is louder, faster, more uncertain, and more complex than it has ever been, a clear signal is the most valuable thing a human being can possess. Chair is what you should sit with, as this ends. Every version of your life that you are not living, every risk you did not take, every conversation you did not have, every opportunity you talked yourself out of existed first as a thought that you believed was true, a thought that said, not yet, a thought that said, not you, a thought that felt like wisdom and was actually fear, dressed in the costume of caution. You cannot get those moments back, but you can change what happens next. Not by thinking more carefully, not by analyzing harder, by seeing, with increasing clarity, the difference between what is actually happening and what your mind is telling you is happening. By learning to trust the still, clear signal beneath the noise. By understanding that the thoughts that feel most urgent and most certain are often the ones most worth questioning. The cost of not doing this is not dramatic. It does not arrive all at once. It arrives as the year that passed and felt somehow smaller than it should have. It arrives as the conversation you kept meaning to have. It arrives as the version of yourself you keep planning to become. Always next quarter. Always after the next thing settles down. The mind that is believed without question does not announce its damage. It just quietly makes the world a little smaller, a little safer, a little less than what you actually came here to do. Do not believe everything you think, not because your mind is your enemy, but because you are so much more than what it tells you. And that's a wrap on the 11 powerful mind hacks from Don't Believe Everything You Think You Need Today. Remember, your mind is your most powerful tool. The way you think shapes the life you live. Start applying even one of these hacks today and watch your perspective change for the better. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Mindcode Vault for more life-changing tips. Drop a comment below and let me know which hack you're trying first. I can wait to hear from you.